A typical web application has three parts. You have the front end, which runs in the browser, which the user interacts with directly. The front end, through the browser, interacts with the back end, which is also known as the web server, sometimes also known as the API server, and they talk to each other via HTTP or HTTPS APIs. An API is short for application programmable interface. It's a fancy way of saying a protocol. The backend and the front end has to agree on a protocol in which through which they would communicate. And sometimes that is also done through WebSocket and even fancier means, but HTTP and HTTPS are most common. The S just stands for secure. In Momen, everything is by default HTTPS, so there cannot be any eavesdropping in the middle. And the backend would talk to the database through SQL. SQL is short for structured query language. It's a common language that the database speaks. And a database is just a glorified spreadsheet. It is a lot more performant than a spreadsheet at scale, typically supporting up to millions or tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of records or rows in spreadsheet terms. But the core functionality is essentially the same. It stores all the shared state of the entire application for all your application users. As a concrete example of how a web application works, we will look at Udemy and we'll see how the front end actually communicates with the back end. So in order to do that, you will need to go into the Chrome debugging tool. Sometimes people call it just CDT. And it sounds a bit technical, but really it isn't. And knowing how to look for communication between the front end and the back end is very important for later debugging because inevitably we will run into bugs and we will need to understand what really went on versus what we thought would go on. To get access to CDT, you could either right click on the page in Chrome and choose inspect. That's one way. Or a lot of times you press F12, that will get you there. But if you're using a Mac and your function key isn't turned off by default, you would press function F12. That will also get you here. And if you did inspect, you would end up somewhere in the elements tab, but the communication happens through the network. Therefore, we should be looking at the network tab. You would probably be in this all section when you start, but we will be looking at mostly fetch. But for this particular purpose, you can stick with all. And let's just do one simple thing. What if we clicked category 2? That should take us to category 2. We should see all the courses that that category 2 has. So once we click, you see that is how we get the information from the backend. In fact, how to you can decipher this. Don't be daunted by the content of that. We can mostly ignore this, but if you go to payload is what is sent from the front end to the back end. And there are a couple of ways you can be looking at this. View sourced is a bit painful to look at. You can also look at like that, which is still very not, well, still pretty annoying to look at. But this is the best that we have. So this request is using GraphQL, as you can probably tell by this name. Momen uses GraphQL. Not all web applications use GraphQL, obviously. Most of them would use RESTful, and some of them you might even see protobuf, but GraphQL is mostly human readable, so that is why we chose it. And you can see what is happening here is we're looking for a course list with some variables, but in here it's looking for course, and you have some kind of a where, which specifies the conditions, and you have an order by. We need to know how to order our courses by, and distinct on, which is like how do we want certain repeated elements. Limit, how many do we return? Offset is basically if you are sorted by something, how many do you skip? And here are the things that we want. For example, we want the ID, we want the cover image, and we want the name of the course, which is going to be shown here, and the price, which is going to be shown here. And variables is basically the things that is then plugged into a query. We'll go into further detail later. And here is the preview is essentially what is actually returned. Preview and response are just two ways of looking at the data. Preview is typically easier. So you can see that we have two courses. We return two courses. Both of them has, as we requested, an ID, a name, a cover image, and the price. The cover image can then further be made up of the URL of the image and the ID of the image. We don't get to see the ID of the image or we don't use it, but by default, we will return the ID of everything that we fetch. And this is how we get the information from to the front end. And that corresponds to this section.